Hi, it's Tony Heywood here from Heywood and Condie, and we're in the Atkinson Gallery today in Southport, and I'd like to take you through our new exhibition called This Land, which is really a portrait of the Sefton coast from Formby up through to Southport, but it's not a portrait in the traditional sense of a landscape painting or a photograph. It's a multimedia sort of installation, quite collagic, and it sort of combines painting, sculpture, textiles, flotsam and jetsam we've collected from the beach, all weave together to sort of realise this portrait that we've called This Land, which really brings into the sort of process of how we have sort of thought through and realised this exhibition. And it's sort of typical of the way we operate as artists. We explore nature and landscape, and we visit many places in the British Isles, and basically, as in this exhibition, it involves us spending days in the field, often doing repeated walks, initially observing the geology, the geography, flora and fauna, all the sort of field study works that you would do when you're sort of assessing or looking at a place. And we collect a large amount of material and bring that back to the studio. So there's a sort of quasi-archaeological, almost anthropological or nature detective aspect to this sort of process of making the artwork. And I guess what we're looking for really is clues as to what makes this place resonate to us. And quite often it can involve me spending time, or Alison meditating in the actual environment itself. I'm very involved in shamanic drumming, and I guess an important thing is we almost can shift our consciousness slightly when we're in these environments to try and using a very big word like divinate, but a way of sort of being and actually being part of that environment, as opposed to a distant remote viewing that you might find when you make a film or a photograph, sort of to get as close to that place as possible. So when we go back to the studio with all this data, we sort of sift through almost forensically and then start compiling both the drawings, paintings and objects together in these sort of huge mood boards, which you can see on the walls of the Atkinson here as almost like collages mounted on these monochromatic, vibrant backdrops, laminates. And that is another thing that I think is quite important and typical of our work, is this sort of pop-like rendition of a place, quite graphic. And really that's to sort of maybe capture how we, or the public, and most of us who live in urban areas, increasingly encounter landscape and nature as a quite a distant, film-like, screen-based, you could almost say, experience, which is often involves looking at images that are pumped up, airbrushed, and highly exaggerated. Often it's like through the marketing of a place. So there's a feeling of this sort of once removed after spending time in it that we're trying to sort of represent here. But what we're after, what we're hoping is that the exhibition that we finally put together is what is called perhaps the spirit of place, or the genius loci, the essence of that environment that we experienced after we've sort of been in it. It's very sort of an attempt to mood tone our own time spent at that environment. And at the Atkinson, in order to provide this sort of journey-like experience, we have sort of, as people move between rooms, we've provided a sort of backdrop in a series of graphic black line drawings that have been hand-painted onto the walls, somewhat abstract, but you can see silhouettes and outlines of forms of sandhills, trees and surfboards, golf links, all sorts of other things. But some of it is a little bit more abstract, but the idea is that these simple line drawings, almost like vistas, take the viewer through from event to event, in the same way that we pause when we're looking at a vista, then zoom in at some detail like an insect or a tin can or a bottle. But all of these things comprise together that memory of what it is to go on a walk. So these sort of large, vibrant, laminate, monochromatic blocks of colour a sort of a way of sort of stopping us in our tracks, arresting us, and then we sort of zoom into this odd juxtaposition of material that we've put together, which has quite a, sometimes a comical and surreal quality to it. A mixture of, for instance, wrappers, sweet wrappers and feathers. And so these become like fragments of memories attached to the wall to conjure back up this spirit of place in detail. So it's the works really, the whole piece is as much a psychological reconstruction as it is physical. So each person who is viewing this will probably bring their own references and associations to it, especially if they haven't actually been walking in that environment themselves. But like any place, it's the soul or the essence of that place is really multiple layers of like a palimpsest of memories and associations. So for me, this Formby has got very deep resonances. I was brought up here as a child in the 60s and 70s, and I've included in the exhibition little fragments of that time, even childhood memories in the form of physical objects that are almost like talismans to me, and even some paintings that were done in the 70s and 80s by me, my first foray into landscape portraiture, and also even paintings done by my mother in the 60s, which were actually hung in the Atkinson Gallery. But to tie all this together, let's take you on a walk through this land. Thank you. So as we enter room 1, the first thing you come across is a sort of vibrant burst of hot coloured laminate supporting these paintings and dresses and shoes and other found and fabricated ephemera. And this section sort of literally includes the dresses and shoes that we wore during the making of a film, This Land. They're sort of fantasy garments that we were wearing to theatricalise this poem. And you can see the poem. It's set to music. It's about 20 minutes long, and you can see it on the Atkinson site. The dress that we made this from came from the charity shop in Formby, and Alison has sort of hand-stitched hundreds of razor clam shells to this sort of soft pink nylon dress, a sort of flowing flesh-coloured form, which is almost mirroring the organism that was in the empty homes of these marine bivalves, which we've been collecting the shells of, that lived in the sand on the beach. And there's a sort of gathering and ordering here of the man-made and the natural going on, and a splicing of sort of hard and soft forms. It's quite surreal, an otherworldly mix, really. As the winkle picker shoes here, contemporary winkle picker shoes, tiny little winkles that we found, and created a sort of marine-like fetish mix here. Further child's shoe in a box is also something we found. Is a fantastic, delicate form, almost clinging on to life. It's very, very fine, stitched thing, full of sand, and it reminds us perhaps of the transient, ephemeral nature of our walks. So the shoe is sort of standing in for a metaphor for the entire sort of movement and footprints that you find on this sand. Certainly in opposition to the hard clay footprint that you can see later in the show. And these sort of shoes, carry on about the shoes, emerges briefly from this sort of tidal drift, which would again just be buried or reclaimed by the tide and the sand. The pastel paintings, the three of them here, they're more permanent rendering of sort of human activity. These were actually done, I think, 1979, 1980s, and they were my sort of first foray into capturing life on the beach, figures drying off or running into the sea. And all of this is sort of mixed up with these framed, dried, random objects that present themselves to us. The crabs here on a board, on a sort of, are ordered and seem almost something that's like a scientific classification, and they're not really. They're sort of put together in terms of shape and form by Alison as sort of almost a counterpoint to these razor clams have attached themselves en masse to a dress that moves. Whereas the bright fabric and the laminate here that is supporting all this almost offset I think to a degree, the beauty of these, the fine organic detail of these almost monochromatic bleached marine exoskeletons. And the two tall chimneys that erupt from the top of the composition suggest to us the industrial silhouette of Liverpool, or maybe even the rail tracks of the from the train line that was created to link Formby to Liverpool. So the splicing of simple graphic forms and blocks of colour here to construct and hold this assemblage of disparate objects together and paintings. It's very much like we were laying down a sort of marine story on top of an industrial palette of colours to realise this presentation of this walk on a beach. We're still in room 1 and passing the first set of line drawings, which feature a sort of abstract rabbit, a skateboarder and a deer, sort of running or scurrying across the dunes. Try to capture quite a lot of movement in these lines. But it leads us into the next walk, and a walk we've taken from Blundell Avenue in Formby or Freshfield down onto the beach and along to Southport Funfair. So, starting in the bottom corner, we've got a sort of formal arrangement of snails inside a gilt frame, which is actually a map of Formby made of snails, a sort of typical of this, I suppose, Victorian shell, kitsch perhaps, taken to a suffocating level here and sort of bursting out of the frame to grapple with an action man we found on the beach. And this idea of layers of strata formation is explored here, I think. Perhaps these land snails really are sort of found in a particular location. Actually, they are specific to this area where nicotine leaves were dumped in the 60s and 70s, and it's now recognised as sort of compressed dark boulders or sort of strata emerging from the dunes. And the vegetation that grows on the top of this particular area is very predominantly nettle and dock, and totally unlike the marram which you find in the rest of the dunes. So this sort of framing and strata and compartmentalisation of forms is mirrored in this sort of snail work. And this idea of slowness and movement is really particular to this area. As the erosion of one storm in a night, you can come across this entire thousands of these shells and then they're buried again under another dark layer. So this sort of framing here is about that process and of a particular area. So we move on here past paintings again. These are done in oils and acrylics this time, of dancing figures and individuals reclining or posing, on the beach. And carry on moving further right or north. We see there's a sort of large yellow pastel coloured 60s cabinet from a parent's house actually, and now filled with strange collected objects. Even a Hornby model train sort of looms out from the dark here. And that's from the 60s, and it's all sort of offset by a piece of poplar driftwood found at Ainsdale actually, and rudely pushes its way out of the door. Now, sort of the scale and the shape of which I think is almost monstrous, really. It's a sort of dark, broody counterforce to these toy dogs which are perched precariously on top of the cabinet, which takes us into the Southport, the Funfair area. After we've crossed the sort of dark green golf links of Burt down the hillside, we're sort of taken into the sweet saccharine confection of Southport arcade games, sort of kitsch memorabilia, hanging forlornly over a pile of flocked cast rocks. And there are sort of these vibrant, almost eye-searing colours of that we flock these rocks in. Maybe even seen as grains of sand, rendered here as sort of artificial coloured, somewhat, I don't know, suggestive of this artificial world of the Funfair and the rock shops of Pleasureland in Southport. So we're looking here at 6 line drawings cut into marble. Now, the idea behind these is really to bring to life all the sketches that I've been involved in doing down at the beach. And it's quite a strange technique, actually. And again, it's a way of sort of getting myself involved in almost an unconscious way, trying to become part of this place. So I've adopted this sort of, it's a surrealist technique. It's called automatic drawing. And quite often I would go down there drumming. I'm quite involved in a shamanic drumming circle, but essentially get myself into quite an altered state of mind. And I would then walk around or sit and do very, very fast sketches of things that I would see on the beach. I've got about 150, 200 of these, but I've selected 6 here. And then what I've done is converted these sort of pencil drawings and put them into a computer package, which equalizes all those graphic lines out, which were thick, thin, slipping everywhere, and you couldn't, some of them faded out, into very, very simplistic 1.5 millimeter width lines. And this line drawing, these simplified line drawings, then have been fed into a routing machine which has then cut into a sheet of marble, a little trench 1 millimeter deep into a marble slab, each one of those. And the empty groove has then been filled with mud collected from the beach, and then it's been sort of coloured with marble dust and a glue and then the whole lot shaved off to present a very, very slick version of something that is quite scattershot when it existed in its first manifestation as a very fast pencil sketch. But each of them feature events and things that are going on the beach. You can see ice cream vans, bonfires, even people with rakes. There's a couple of riders on horses, sand hills, barbecues. Not always, they're not really evident. They don't really pop out. And quite often with these works, one thing will, a large thing will be drawn over the top of something else, so the lines get mixed up. But in essence, each one portrays a particular scene of something that I'd been witnessing on one of our walks. Now we're in the middle room of the show, which is somewhat the powerhouse of the exhibition, really, I think. You can see this sort of line of 5 powerful totemic-like figures which really dominate the space, and each one is literally made from materials collected from particular and distinct key environments that we've passed through on all our walks from Formby to Southport. So they're a sort of summation of each of these environmental zones. I suppose in this way they feel a little bit like our guides. They're physical materials, but they almost narrate the routes that we take if we were to actually physically deconstruct their material contents. Now, each of them started out as individual screens, like wooden frames, that Alison is very keen in experimenting with these sort of hand weaving techniques, back loom techniques. And she uses yarn and fabric. She begins with yarn and fabric to get a colour palette together that you can see gets more and more flamboyant as the screens towards the end. But each of them involves this weaving around a frame, and the coloured yarns have given way to rope, nylon, string, and even bramble and grass have all been used as raw materials to weave this rich tapestry and tie in all the objects that we've been collecting. So, the first totem, perhaps we can call it our beach guide, is made from shells, driftwood, mollusks, marram grass, seaweed, and a whole range of other flotsam and jetsam. Some rusting, barbed wire, all sorts of things that we found on the beach and been collecting. So it's almost like a condensed power object, if you want to look at it like that, of the beach. The next figure is the Woodland Totem. This is an assemblage of sort of dried plants, fungus, bark, twigs of birch, oak, mainly pine needles that are typical of the woodland hinterland. The third garden totem takes us into a sort of world of our own backyard. It's made of, looking here, dried and pressed plants from our own garden, sunflowers, thistles, alliums, lavenders and hops. And there's even garden pot figurines and hoses. It's a sort of a more domesticated figure, I suppose you could say. And the fourth and fifth really relate to the increasingly artificial and urban settings of Southport itself. They're far zingier, brighter, punchier. And they've got all this sort of artificial glamour of the Funfair and shops of Southport. And the final figure you can see is the fifth one is really assembled from a total dizzying array of moulded plastic and artificial materials, from rocks, sticks of rocks, to toys, fruit machine reels donated by Silcott's Funfair, and one even has a sort of Cape of Penny Falls ticket. So it's got quite a regal feel, I think, this one. But they're all draped in neon and provide this sort of otherworldly glamour to each one of their respective personas. So I think, if we sort of see this room as being a condensed version of the walks that are portrayed in the other two rooms, but they're a sort of gathering together of all this ephemera and this sort of the creation of almost like tutelary spirit figures, I suppose. We're in the third room now, and this installation it portrays a walk we often do from the mosses of Hightown to an area once called Gypsy Wood in Freshfield. It sort of wraps around all three walls with a central, almost shrine-like area, and finishes with a sort of bang and crash of a storm. So, starting off on the left, as you enter, you're sort of confronted with the almost aggressive dark world of pheasant shooting and the army range near Hightown, between Hightown and Formby. The ghillie suits, in a way, splices together this world of hiding and camouflage with the world of bird watching, sort of common to both. It's all about concealment and sort of not overt aggression, really, played out on the fields and the coasts of Formby here. And the corner tapestry work is really a patchwork of almost hunting tapestries. And we sort of get a view which through to it as a sort of glimpsed through the feathered branches of a dried pine, again sort of to obscure and give us a feeling of secrecy and seclusion. So the army range in Hightown is a sort of very exciting world to a child, and I often spent hours in my teens there, and the sort of rubber shapes there at the beginnings that was just soften it all, or actually moulds from army machinery found on the site. Anyway, passing beyond the tapestry, we arrive at what appears to be a sort of plume of smoke coming from the sort of makeshift bonfire, which features sort of three explosive shapes. Now, these are almost like dreamlike images, but they are, in fact, intricately detailed photo painting montages composed of photographs which are overpainted. They each feature compositions and graphics that I've sort of lifted from 60s glamour magazines. And these sort of magazines were really exciting, almost off-limits reading for young boys found in the news agents of Formby, and their graphic content here I've sort of re-updated, and I've rendered them out, but with portraits of myself and family, sort of in place of superheroes and other subject matter. Sort of real fantasy stuff, and I admit, very, very self-indulgent, really. As is the next section. So the next central section really has an altar-like quality. It sort of features a self-portrait and paintings done. One is in fact done by my daughter, Holly, and there's even a painting of me done by Mother in the 1960s, and another landscape, which was actually hung in the Atkinson Gallery itself in 1969. So this is all of these sort of old, really time-driven pieces of information are all sort of intermixed with more other power objects that we've created now, or which are either framed or placed on the floor. So let's take a look at those. Well, just a few, we've got time. The digestive biscuits and woodpecker fetish, we call it, as a sort of chosen for the sort of surreal association, but beauty and colour. And this mixing of almost again the fantastic and the simplistic and the banal really being spliced together to make something far more powerful. The sunblessed loaf bread wrapper, faded. I think it's probably dated 1978, 1980, something like that. And it features a real dried Natterjack's toad sitting on there. Again, next to its inflatable counterpart, but this is an iconic amphibian of our local wetland slacks, It's, again, this sort of quite strange, surreal mixture of the real and the false, the blown up, the exaggerated. Anyway, we move up to the right-hand corner and you can see a worm cast necklace. This is Alison has threaded 30 metres of sandworm onto a nylon string to make a sort of long, snake-like, continuous, natural charm of worm casts, actually. It's unbelievably delicate, and it's presented here by these sort of mannequin dummy hands from Debenham Southport as I suppose you call it a sort of surreal offering. There's more pine squirrel shoes from our ritual collection, and you can see those on the floor, which really takes us to the final wall. Now, the last wall really is a very particular assemblage, and it's presented across this sort of graphic outline of sandhills on the beach, which you can see, painted in black painted line. It really features an area of pine forest that was last seen in the 70s, I guess. It was washed out to sea during one very violent stormy night. And it was in an area known as, it's no longer known, but it was called Gypsy Wood. And the trees were literally felled by the sea. And it's visualised here with casts of real Formby pine trees done in resin, which appear to be sort of tumbling forward. And they're accompanied by this sort of quite explosive topping of a thunderous image of a jewel-like burst or explosive shape, which sort of gives the whole piece a sense of drama and theatre, I think, and sort of captures that broodiness and the brightness of that particular night, which has left a real distinct memory for me. We went down to the beach to sort of watch this happen. The shell suit at the front of all of this is another sort of fantasy garment. Alison used to live in East London and was sort of captivated by the pearly kings and queens, and has sort of embellished here a Formby charity shop suit with local marine shells in some form of homage. Again, this sort of mixing of her time in London with her time spent in Formby. So this garment, again, we've worn it during the making of this film, and it's a literal weaving together of things we found, things we wear, and then it gets repurposed again in a film. So it's again a tying together of things to give almost the insignificant a sense of place and a sense of importance to us, and theatricalises Formby and theatricalises our walks. We're looking at a piece now called From Fisherman to Funfair. Now this really is quite a strange sort of hybrid. It's a real compression of two very distinct materials that I suppose really identify with this coast. And they really span an entire timeline, which takes us from where we were to perhaps, could even say, where we're going. So the first is the footprint itself. Now this, oddly enough, is actually a sort of 5,000-year-old Mesolithic footprint lifted from the mud in Formby and has been left to dry out for nearly 2.5 years. It was rescued before anybody says anything, and I'm not encouraging anybody to go down and lift footprints. It was about to be destroyed by quad bikers and other vehicles, so I sort of took pity on the footprint and lifted it. But it is actually a human footprint left to dry out. Now that's been presented here on a plinth, and during its process of drying out has really cracked and given it almost a comic book-like prehistoric feel, which I think is really quite marvellous. I can almost hear that sort of great big thud of a Jurassic footprint. Or I know it's not of that period. It's got that sort of quality to it. But more than anything else, it's sort of positioned just below the Funfair sign, which is sort of the winning neon flashing sign that indicates that you would have arrived and you've got your takings from the arcade game at Southport. So from that early existence of children and hunters on the hunter-gatherers, you would say, from that period on the beach of Formby, to the new economy of Southport, sort of put together in two objects, really. The painting, or photo painting as we might call it, that we're looking at is something that's very, very, well, it's obviously very personal to me. It's actually a sort of portrayal of Formby and a moment in time that, one of the most poignant moments, it was about my father's death. I've spent many years coming backwards and forwards looking after him. And then I made this sort of real full-scale model of Formby and then photographed it from above. So what you're looking at actually is a sort of composition that's made up on the ground of sand, real fishes, butterflies, models of a Freshfield station, casts of railway lines, trees and mosses, all sorts of features there that would comprise a sort of map of Formby. And then the centre is a clay model actually of my father in his last moments. And what I was doing was filming in order to get this sort of quite illuminated stained glass feel. The composition is made up on the floor, and then the camera is suspended on a ceiling, and each individual element is burnt into the celluloid, so to speak, as I illuminate the various parts with a fine torch beam, and the camera shutter is left on open. So when you close the shutter, just the little bits that have been illuminated come to life, and it gives it a very sort of baroque, rich feel, as well as having that sort of stained glass quality. But that's a piece there, but it's I wanted to include it. So we're in the final room 4 of the exhibition, which really feature a series of very recent paintings, some even done during lockdown, that have been allowed to show in this sort of extra room. And these are all oil on board landscapes, and I guess they're really a recent further development from my automatic line drawings that you saw in the other room, that were ones that were inlaid in marble. And each painting really begins their life as a series of automatic drawings. Again, this sort of technique adopted by surrealists, which is sort of tapping into the unconscious. And the idea, it really involves me actually sketching almost blindly in response, in this particular instance, to films that I've made on the beach. So each one of these paintings is a response to a short film that I've made whilst on a walk, and then sort of converted into a painting. So what you're actually looking at is almost multiple overlaying images of objects, events, vistas or scenes that I've been filming. So you can see the ice cream vans, pine trees, sand dune formations, or golf course bunkers and flags, for instance, all mixed up with figures of people, dogs, birds and horses, and other randomly selected objects that were filmed. So it's a sort of multi-layered narrative of a particular moment. So I guess for me, the interest is in how to present or capture those moments when one is taking a walk on a beach. And these video films are sort of, rather than photographs or films, what you're actually looking at is a sort of, as if a film is being played almost, I say instantaneously, loop one image over the top of another. So rather than have a 5-minute duration as a linear story, there it becomes a sort of instant compressed version of a film. A shot of a bird on top of a group of campers next to a fire, all given equal visual value, and they're all combined together as one complete memory as a painting, or as rendered out in paint. And these sort of intense patches of colour really not only they're lifted from the colours that I've been using to make the paintings, but more importantly, they sort of resemble these sort of big glitches of dots that you come across when you're working in film, and you're stopping it, and in this sort of high def image processing, you suddenly see these blocky lumps of colour if you really zoom in, and these pixelated glitches are sort of here reference the actual process of filmmaking itself, and they're sort of, I'm trying to combine that into the imagery of the line drawings and paint that have gone to make up the actual painting itself.